Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video from Oman Talks NRL SuperCoach. In today's video, we're going to be going through the second row forward guns analysis. Decided to split this into two just because I thought the video might just become way too long if I go through all of the potential picks in the second row. So we're going to focus on the higher price guys, kind of ranging from your top tier guys all the way down to your 500Ks. And we'll discuss mid-ranges and more value picks in a separate video. So if you're looking for that, you won't find that in this video. If that's what you're not interested in, then obviously click off. But the hope is that you still get some value out of this. Do please consider subscribing if you are new to the channel and want to see more content during the preseason and also through the 2025 year as well. Apologies for my voice. It's a little bit not great at the moment, but we'll persist for sure. Do follow me on Instagram and Twitter as well, and I've also now got a Patreon as well if you want to access the spreadsheets for my trade planner or draw difficulty, or if you just want to show support or get some extra content as well. I'm going to be getting all of that through Patreon, so links will all be in the description below. But that said, let's get into the video. So as always, firstly wanting to take a look at the second row forward position and how does it rank in terms of placement in the top 20 averaging players. Generally, you find that there's probably going to be about 3 to 5 second row forwards in your top 20 each year. Familiar names as well. Dave Fafita has been a consistent one in the last 2 years. Angus Crichton was a huge revelation again last year after a few barren years where he was a former Supercoach gun, and he really brought that back last year in 2024. And a couple of new names as well. Isaiah Yeo kind of creeping into there. He's always been steady and solid, but game went to another level. He had a 74 average from last year. Eli Katoa also doing very well last year with a 73. And a few names that probably people are looking at as maybe more value picks. Tina Fasumalawi with a huge average in 2023 and also featuring pretty up there in 2022. He's now very underpriced and is available also in the front row. I spoke about him in the front row video, so won't be talking about him in this particular one. But I'm looking at like a Jermaine Hopgood who's featuring there in 2023. I know a lot of people are interested in him because he had an injury affected last season, so maybe they're thinking he's also someone who offers some value. Same with Cam Murray, who featured in 2022 and is now should be making an early return back in round 1. So he's got a lot of people interested. We will definitely speak about those players, but let's get into it. So starting off with the gun second row forwards from last year who averaged over 70. So we're looking here at Angus Crichton, Dave Fafita, Isaiah Yeo, Eli Katoa, Hudson Young, and Britton Nickera. So maybe before I start getting into the individual players, just kind of framing up the entire video and I guess squad structure, how you're thinking of building it in terms of having a second row forward and how expensive do you want to go. Because at the moment, I actually don't have a squad structure where I've factored for like a 700 or a very high 600K second row forward. I've been choosing to spend that money. I've at the moment still gone with the 3-gun fullback route, so a lot of money gets taken up there. Tried to get in the gun center wing like a Karaz or like a Ruben Garrick as well. And I found the second row forward then all of a sudden starts lacking. But I do think that maybe not necessarily a player from this list, but I think I'm going to try to get a second row forward who's above 600 and maybe 620, 630K, just around that 600K mark probably. The reason for that is you want to have that flexibility to move on and off players if you get things wrong at the beginning of the season, and we inevitably will. No one's going to be able to pick that perfect 25. Well, I'm sure there's going to be some people out there, and congrats to you when you do that. It's probably not going to be me though. And so I want to have that flexibility to be able to move around if I've got something wrong and one of these guns really starts popping off. And I guess the difference with second row is that because they're in the forwards, they've got that generally better work rate than, say, if you're spending 700K on a center, unless there's someone like a Karaz or Garrick who do have goal kicking or have a very, very high work rate. Generally, these second row forwards will probably, in this early part of the season, outscore some of those center wings because their scoring is much more volatile. Whereas with second row forwards, as long as they kind of cross maybe a couple of tries in the opening 4 to 5 games, they're probably going to be able to maintain their average. So I'm leaning more and more towards trying to get a gun second row forward into my team if I can. So starting off, we've got Angus Crichton, who, as I said, was an absolute revelation last year. He came in around the mid 400s and he was so popular because everyone knew that he was someone who in the past has been an absolute weapon when it comes to Supercoach, and he really proved that again last year. An average of 78. He had 9 games where he scored over 80, so that's 45% of the time. But he did also have some really, really big tons in there as well. Just having a quick look back at last year, he had some scores of 119, 151, where he did score a double, and then also 132. He was someone who, when he got those big attacking stats, and I will say as well, there were times when I remember him being so close to them and didn't quite getting them. So that 78 average probably could have been even better. And the first couple of games were kind of him returning, and so his minutes weren't quite up to that 80-minute mark. When he got to 80 minutes, his average was 84 last year, which was by far the best of any of these second row forwards. Now he's 7% ownership, so he's not actually that highly owned. One is due to price. That's very expensive, paying 758k. I think the biggest reason that he's not maybe as highly owned as you would expect, I think it's because of the changeover in the Roosters lineup. Like Luke Keary was a big factor in him scoring all of those tries that he did last year. And with Luke Keary not there anymore, and I think a new halves combination, especially with Sam Walker still not being there for the beginning of the year, probably likely going to be Sandon Smith and Chad Townsend. You just don't know how that's going to quite work out and how that's going to affect those edge back rowers on the outside there. I think with Angus, because he was so try-reliant, one thing, his base was probably a little bit down last year than on other seasons. So his base average from last year was 44. In seasons gone past, in his peak years in, say, 2019, 2020, he was someone who was getting more around the 50-55 mark in terms of base. So there was a notable drop-off in his kind of base, but he was very destructive. Like his evasive numbers of 20, a lot of that came from tackle busts, but also from line breaks as well. So I think with Angus, like just when you're paying absolute top dollar for someone, just not even in second row, but in any position, you want to have that kind of confidence that, yep, this is going to be, I'm going to be paying for what I get. And I'm just not sure that, at least to begin the year, with that turnover in the Roosters lineup, being so attacking stat reliant, and these attacking stats do generally, they're on the lower end at the beginning of the season. If you want to see some stats that I've done on that, I did a best early draw video a while ago, and I've gone into some detail in terms of scoring trends for early parts of the season. And if you're more reliant on attacking stats, you're probably going to not have as much joy as you will in the latter parts of the season. So I think it's probably those couple of factors. That's why Angus isn't as popular. And at the moment, he hasn't really been a thought to have in my team. And mainly it's due to price. I think he's just very, very expensive. Very similar with Dave Fafita. Now Fafita is obviously a bit different, where he's racing the clock to be fit for round one. That's why his ownership is actually like 1.5-2%. So no surprises there in terms of his ownership being so low. But he is probably someone who, when fit and available, he's always someone who you look at for SuperCoach, because he's just got such a friendly game for SuperCoach. Lots of tackle busts, likes to offload, but he also gets creative. It gets attacking stats like try assists and line break assists as well. He had 55% of his games last year over 80. Like his floor is ridiculous. Like if you look at the 46 plus 22 in base and evade, that's 68 points, and that pretty much does come from base and power, like tackle busts and offloads and things like that. His try scoring was down though last year, and probably the most notable thing was the presence of Jaden Campbell. So I'm not going to take credit for this particular stat. I've seen this stat originally posted by SuperCoach Experience, and I've seen a couple of others do it as well. So obviously check out SC Experience's content, but it was really, really telling when it was an 86 average without Jaden Campbell and a 67 average with. That probably tells me enough, where I think combined with the injury affected beginning of the season, I would definitely want to see how he fares with Campbell again this year. Is that just going to be the norm, or was that just maybe a bit of an outlier? But hey, look, for round one, you're probably not going to be spending that much money when he's under that injury cloud as it is. And even when he's back, I think he's not going to be someone who automatically will just trade straight back into my team. I think I want to see how he works with Jaden Campbell before taking that plunge. But we know that when he's kind of on top of his game, he's an amazing option for SuperCoach. Now, Isaiah, most popular owned of the kind of more expensive second row forward guns, he's at 10% ownership. And just in a very different way though, if you look at those top two guys in terms of percentage games over 80, we're looking at 45-55. Isaiah is 27%, and that's actually the lowest of anyone on this list here. No surprises though, he's just like meat and potatoes is probably doing him a disservice because he's so much more than that, but he is just the most safe and most consistent one on the list here. An average base of 55 is head and shoulders above all the others here. The evasive numbers of 12 is a little bit further down, especially on Fafita and Crichton. But that's still, we're looking at totality of about 65 to 67 in kind of base power, and he's just ultra consistent. So I've actually got this more deep dive analysis on Isaiah just because he was the higher owned of the second row forward guns, and I just wanted to dig into the numbers as to see why was last year all of a sudden kind of his best year. But I think it's just ever improvement from him. Like if you go back to 2021, average is going from 57 to 66 to 69 to 74. Now, he's just on that upward trajectory, and I think these numbers show it as well, especially in the key metrics of not base stats, because his bases have always been very solid, 53, 54, and 55 the last few seasons. So also on an uptick, but pretty solid. But if you look at all the other numbers like evasive and creative, they're all just stepping up by a couple of points per year. So the evasive numbers 12, 9, 7 in the last 3. If you look at the creative numbers 6, 5, 3, I think that's just because he's just getting better and better as a player. Many will call him the best lock in the game. If you look at his SuperCoach points from try assists, tackle breaks and offloads, all of them are going up and up in the last 3 seasons. Now, there's obviously going to be a cap to things. Like, he's not just going to keep improving year on year. I do think that 74 is probably going to be around where he would land again, if I had to guess. But the one thing that we probably don't quite know is how he's going to uplift his game now that there's no Jerome Luai at Penrith. Because with Luai there, obviously, he would take a lot of the attacking ball. But without Luai now, does Isaiah step up in terms of controlling that team? You would think so. And so I can see why so many people are wanting to spend that higher money on him. Just knowing that because he's got that really safe floor in terms of base, and it's better than a lot of those other second row forward guns, if we just go back to that. Plus, you combine that with his ever-improving kind of role in the Penrith team, I can see why so many people are starting with him. And I think if you are honestly going to spend more than 700k, I would just probably go with him or Katoa. The safety thing with Isaiah is that he's just never going to really give you a bad score. Like, his low score last year, I think, was 49, but this is when he was playing lower minutes. When he's generally playing his normal minutes of 70, 80, like 70 to 80, his low scores are generally 65. He's probably the best definition of set and forget. So I can definitely understand the appeal of him. I would actually be picking him over Angus and definitely Fafita at this point in time. If I had to edge between him and Katoa, who we'll just step on to now, so he's 717k. Probably got higher upside, 9 games scoring over 80, 41% of the time. Again, I need to give credit here to the SE Whisperer who actually found these numbers. Katoa had a 79 average with Cam Munster and a 66 average without. Now that's pretty telling, and I think there's probably some narratives you can draw from that. With Munster on the field, commands more ball, more the opposition are going to be paying a bit more attention to him, and that frees up the space on the right-hand side for the Storm, where they've got Jerome Hughes and Eli Katoa. Now, Eli Katoa really stepped up his game last year as well. Like, again, as I think the partnership with Jerome Hughes really excelled. Hughes obviously going on to win the Dally M. Now, if I had to pick between Yo or Katoa, there's only a 10k difference in price. I think Melbourne have got that early buy, which is a little bit frustrating. So they've got that buy in round 2. But if you're willing to kind of absorb that, I think I'd probably take Katoa more just because you've got that upside, I guess. You've got that higher ability, you've got that more frequent ability to get over 80. Yes, you can maybe argue that defenses have maybe will try to start figuring him out as well, but he's also someone who I think, last year I think he scored about 10, 11 tries. I can easily see that happening again this year. He is their main go-to attacking outlet in terms of edge, definitely much more than a Sean Bloor. I think for 10k less, I'd probably chance it with Katoa and hope that you get to a fast start, because Melbourne's draw is actually not that bad on paper. After Parramatta in round 1 and then the bye in round 2, it's Penrith round 3, but longer term then you're looking at Dragons, Manly, Warriors, Dolphins, Rabbitohs, Canberra, Tigers, Sharks before a bye in round 12. Overall, it's a pretty good run. Like, they get that game with Penrith out early in the season, and so then therefore when attacking numbers do generally uptick, which is from around rounds 4, round 5 onwards, that's when Melbourne actually have a good run. So you can see someone who Katoa being a little bit maybe frustrating in the first 3 rounds. Maybe the play could be you don't go with him the first 3 and then you trade into him in round 5. That might be the most reasonable strategy, but you obviously do want to be prioritizing trades for other things like jumping on cheapies and things. Whereas Penrith, they don't have a bye all the way until round 11. So Isaiah, obviously he's going to get impacted with Origin. You can just pick him from round 1, set and forget all the way till round 12. I really think that decision between those two comes down to your play style and what do you would you rather just have the set and forget safety net, or would you want to chase the upside with an Eli Katoa, but also factor in that you do have that early buy? Me personally, I'd probably chance it with Katoa. I mean, Isaiah is so solid and so safe, but I think I'd probably lean towards just getting that guy who I think can push those bigger scores, whereas Isaiah is just your ultra consistent guy. Now, the other two in Hudson Young and Britton Nickera, much lower owned at only 2% and 3%. Hudson Young is, look, I'm just going to be very open and honest. He's not my kind of pick, I think, Supercoach wise. Yes, while his season average was 70, it really comes in clumps, and he is definitely much more inconsistent than a lot of these other guys. Like, while the base is there of 47, if you look at his other scoring breakdowns, evasive numbers of 17 is third behind Fafita and Crichton, but a lot of that doesn't necessarily come from like tackle busts and offloads like it does with those other guys. It comes more from line breaks. So really his biggest scores come hand in hand with when he scores those attacking stats like tries with the line breaks. And he scored 10 tries last year. He scored 9 in 2023. He scored 13 in 2022. Like, he is a try scoring back rower. The problem is that when he doesn't score those tries, his scores tend to be sub 60. So I looked at last year, 50% of his games were below 60, but then he had 5 tons, which was, I think, more than any of these other guys. So he's just going to be someone who I think is a frustrating own if you pick him and then he just goes on a run where he's not scoring that many tries, and then you sell him, and then all of a sudden the next 5 games he's scored 4 tries and gone kind of 80, 90, 70, 100, blah, blah, blah. I think he's just that kind of player, and so therefore that's just not really for me. I think if I'm looking at spending close to 700k, I'd spend it on someone like Katoa, who look, Katoa is similar to Hudson Young in that respect, but his base work rate is probably still a little bit better than Hudson Young, where I think Hudson Young, if he doesn't get attacking stats, probably looking at 50, 60. I think Katoa was about the same, but he's had games where he's pushed 65, 70. But I think the ability for Katoa to go bigger more frequently is there. So I think I'd rather chance it with Katoa, or you just go ultra safe with it, Isaiah Yeo. So yeah, look, Hudson Young is he's a try scoring back rower. The numbers suggest that, but I think he's just too inconsistent for my liking. I think I'd be very frustrated, especially at the beginning of the season, if you make that pick and then he doesn't start with a bang, and then you're just like, oh, what have I done here? I'm going to have to trade out of him. And more likely, you're going to be missing then his big scores. I think if you pick him, you just need to kind of stick with him. He's one of those picks you get him and just let him ride for the rest of the season, and then just catch those big scores and it all nets out. But of course, that's not how we play Supercoach. The aim of the game is to maximize points at all points of time. You want to trade into players on their hot runs and trade out of them on their bad runs, etc. And that's similar with Britton Nikora. Like, it was really a season of 2 halves with him last year. So the first half of the season, 1 to 13, he had an average of 54, and then 14 to 27, he went absolutely massive and had an average of 84, which is completely the opposite of what happened in 2023. Because I looked back at this. In 2023, he actually started the first half of the season on fire, and then the second half was when he really fell off a cliff. So again, he feels like someone who, his runs are probably more predictable, but I think probably not someone I'll start with, just because Sharks do have a few tougher games to open the season, but they do have a good few set of games coming from round 5. I think with Nikora, it really comes down to, he's really an eye test player for me. Like, I benefited a lot last year picking him up. I think it was around round 12. That's because, look, he's Kiwi, so he plays through those origin rounds, and I think that's generally the common strategy with him, is to pick him up around those weeks. And he went on a run all of a sudden at the time that I picked him, and it was just luck that when I got him, they had a few good games. He was available during Origin, and that's when his run started, and he became a great hold for me for the rest of the year. So I think for him, it's really eye test, and I think I haven't seen him play yet this preseason, so it remains to be seen. If I had to pick one of these guys on this list here, for me, it probably would be Katoa. I think Storm, just a very settled team. I think his combination with Hughes will continue to flourish. And if Munster's there from round 1, the numbers do suggest that there is an uptick. So there could even be an ability to spike some bigger scores from him at the earlier end of the season. Otherwise, I think if you want to go ultra safe, I think you go Isaiah Yeo. But where my eyes are actually looking is more at the next set of players, which we'll get onto now. So we're taking a look now at the gun second row forwards who kind of average between the 60 to 70 range. And based on the comments I've been getting on Instagram when I was asking for some suggestions on player deep dives, it looked like a lot of people are fishing in this particular price range. So the players that we're looking at on the list here are Hamali Olukwatu, Jermaine Hopgood, Pat Carrigan, Keon Kolomatangi, Dylan Lucas, Cam Murray, and Jacob Preston. There are a few names in here that I have excluded, one being Jaden Sewer. Again, I don't know if this is just some unconscious bias, because he actually averaged 67 last year, but it didn't feel like something that would be easily repeatable. He's not traditionally a Supercoach gun. And also Jeremiah Nanai, I'll openly admit this is purely a bias thing, where he's similar to Hudson Young. He's just not my kind of second row forward pick, because he is very attacking stat reliant. And especially with the Cowboys, I think going through some changes, I just don't think that's something I want to be betting on at the beginning of the season. I probably want a bit more reliability if I am looking at someone around this price range. Now, a lot more variability in the scoring breakdowns as well. So Olukwatu, we're starting off with, look, he's just been a Supercoach gun of the past as well. Also, just going to preface, I might be flicking through slides a little bit more because I've got a lot more deep dives on these particular players that we can look at. But starting off with Haumole Olakau'atu, pretty consistently year last year with an average of 68, 5 games over 80, which was 26% of the time. He's currently the highest owned, 18% of these second row forwards on the list here. In his non-injury games, which was only really one game that I had to factor in, his average did improve to 71.1. So there's a little bit of value. He is probably someone who I would suspect to be tipping around that early 70s average. So there probably is going to be a little bit of value with him. In terms of his scoring breakdown, he isn't the highest base stat guy. What you get with Olakau'atu is those extra tackle busts and offloads and the ability to score those tries as well. Like if you just look at the list here, he has the highest in terms of the evasive numbers. Also almost up there as well scoring wise. Only Preston's a little bit above him, but definitely highest also in the creative because he is very focal to that Manly right side attack. Just having a bit of a deep dive on him. So the reason I think he's much more higher owned than a lot of those others is, yes, historically he is someone who is kind of that high 60s averaging player, 68.5 in 2023. It was 65 in 2022. And also I think it's Manly's draw. So if you look at the draw, they've got 5 of the first 7 games at home. Pulling some numbers, so I was looking at his averages at home games in 2024, 23 and 22. His average does increase in every one of those seasons. So his average last year at 4 Pines Park was 69.5, 71.5 in 23 and 68.5 in 22. So I can see the appeal because what I can see here is that, let's say if you think non-injury affected games average 71.1, plus then you factor in a lot of home games to start and it doesn't have a bye until round 9. You know, he would be pushing for an origin berth as well. So maybe the opening form, he would be trying to be, pushing a claim for New South Wales again. You could see someone who is 71.1 plus maybe another 2 to 3 points. Again, you could be looking at a mid-70s average. And this is where the question of value starts coming in. A lot of those guys we were looking at in the previous slide, like say an Eli Katoa or an Isaiah Yeo, I would say, yeah, they're probably going to be around that early 70, mid-70s average. But if you think that Olakau'atu can get close to that as well, he's like 60, 70, 80k cheaper than those guys, and every dollar counts basically, and especially the beginning of the year. So I definitely see the appeal, I think, with going in Olakau'atu instead of one of those, saving that money. And I don't think it's a big risk thinking that he might get into that kind of early 70s average. The numbers do suggest that at home he does fare better, and I think that's just a consequence of Manly in general are much better when they're playing at home. And the good thing with Olakau'atu just being a back rower, he's not going to be so attacking stat reliant, but the first 4 games of Cowboys, Warriors, Canberra and Parramatta, 3 of those being at home, they do look really appealing. If you can spike some early tries in those weeks, then I think you'll be laughing because I think a lot of people will be looking at getting him and his price will start to increase as well. There is a bit of a dip in his average last year without Tom Trbojevic, but that was probably just a function of Manly in general. 23 was 77.3 and 2022 was 69.5. So and again, these are very small sample size, so we do need to add that kind of context when looking at those averages. But looking back the last few years, his base and his base power has been pretty consistent. So I really do think it's a question of, do you think he can spike some early attacking stats? I think with that draw that Manly have, I think he can. And there is generally an uptick in his average when he's playing at home. So I think Olakau'atu at 666k, he is probably my number 1 pick of the guys on the list here, just to be very kind of clear. But this is more also picking him at second row. There's one guy on this list here who you can pick up at center. I really like him a lot, but I would pick him at center, not at second row. Now, Jermaine Hopgood, so many people are interested in him, although I feel like this is more of an online thing, because if you look at his ownership on SuperCoach, it's only 7% at the moment, not a whole great amount. 657k, priced with an average of 67. Now, the thing with Hopgood is that we saw in 23, he was just an absolute revelation, amazing cash cow, and was an absolute gun. He had an over 70 average. And if you look at his over 60-minute games in the last 2 seasons, his average increases to 76.1. He's got great base stats, so he's got a base average of 52, and that was from last season. Just looking back as well at 2023, his base average was 57, and that's because his average minutes were a lot higher in 23. And if you look at individually the games where he played over 60 minutes, so in both of those seasons, his average base does go up 3 points. So it was 55 in 2024 and 60 in 2023. So even if you take his 2024 numbers when he's averaging over 60 minutes, it was up to 72 points. So I think he feels a bit like an Isaiah Yeo type, where not necessarily consistency of minutes being a question, because Isaiah is obviously going to be playing bigger minutes than Hopgood more generally, but it's more that Hopgood's got that better base than say like a Olukwatu, where if you think he's going to get those minutes, then he could be a great option. He did get some attacking stats more so in 23 that did boost his average up compared to last year. But even if you ignore that, you just look at his last year numbers where you think, if I get someone who's going to play over 60 minutes and get me around a 70 average, look, there's some value there. He's priced at 67, and he's a bit of a safety net. He doesn't rely so much on attacking stats. I guess the difficulty I have with Hopgood is that he's just coming back from, obviously he had that back surgery last year that kept him out, but then he also picked up a very minor knee injury, which he's had surgery for in the offseason. Now, this was back in December, and as per NRL Physio, supposedly he had about, I think by early Feb or end of January, he should be back in training. I haven't seen any footage to support this, but because just like currently in my draft, he's not there, mainly because that he's coming back from an injury, and ideally, I don't want to be picking up guys, especially who are pretty expensive, maybe Cleary aside, who are coming back from injuries, and that especially may hurt their minutes because he may be integrated, and at the beginning of the season, he may not be getting 60 minutes, he may be getting 50, 55, and then all of a sudden you've picked a guy who's probably just going to be either at his value or maybe a little bit less. Whereas maybe the tactic will be to jump on in round 5. For example, the draw really probably does open up for Parramatta from round 5. And maybe at that point as well, you've got a bit more solidity, or you've got a bit more view on his minutes. Parramatta do run a generally pretty big bench. I think a lot of it does come down to the hooker situation. If it's a 3-forward bench and they've got like a Madison, they've got Jack Williams has now moved across there as well, and someone else whose name is escaping me, then maybe there's potential for Hopper to play bigger minutes. But yeah, it's just minutes is the big question, because the numbers clearly show that when he plays more than 60, he's an amazing Supercoach option. But I think I'd probably rank Olukwatu just a bit above him. At least with Olukwatu, you know that he's a 80-minute man on an edge with a much better draw, I think, on paper as well to begin the year. Pat Carrigan at 642k. Look, his 7% ownership actually was a little bit surprising to me. I thought it'd be a little bit lower than that. Look, he is like Isaiah Yeo, 3 games over 80 last year, which is only 14% of the time. He's not going to be someone who spikes those big scores. He's a very set and forget, very steady option. But I think when you pay 640, I think you probably want a little bit more than that. I just pay 20k more and get Olukwatu, who I think, I look at Carrigan, I think, yep, 66 average. I can probably predict that for him, maybe 66, 68. Olukwatu, I think, look, he could maybe step up into the low 70s. He's done that in seasons past as well. Just about trying to pick the timing of when that might happen. The reason I put Carrigan on the list here is there's a lot of talk about him moving into the front row rotation instead for the Broncos. If that's the case and he's available at front row, then it's a completely different question, because then you're getting someone who's a great front row option. But in second row, I just don't quite think he's probably going to be my preference when you stack him up with these other guys. Similar with Kalamatangi. So last year, Kalamatangi really benefited when he was playing in the middle. He had a 73.7 average in the middle last year, but only 54 when playing on the edge. Now, if you look at preseason footage, he looks really lean, really trim. He's spoken very positively about the impact of Wayne Bennett. So I don't mind taking that punt if you just think that someone like Bennett's going to get the best out of him. But the problem is that he's probably going to be playing on the edge, especially with Cam Murray looking like he'll be fit for round 1. So I think Kalamatangi maybe a bit of a pod option, but probably not for me, just because I think if he was playing in the middle, that's really where he was getting his big scores last year. I think on the edge, yes, the attacking stats might go up, but his work rate does also go down. And historically, he's not one of those big base stat work rate type of guys either. So Kalamatangi, probably not for me, but I can understand if you're like a Rabbitoh supporter wanting to start with him. Now, Dylan Lucas at 616k is very, very interesting. 8% ownership. If you didn't get the hint already, he's the person who I'd be picking at center instead of second row. At second row, I don't think he's worth that 617k. I think you're better off just going for one of these likes of Hamoli or maybe a Hopgood, or stepping up a little bit more to like an Eli Katoa. At center wing though, it feels a bit more like old school Supercoach when you loved having second row forwards available in your second center wing, because it just meant that they were super consistent and you didn't get that fluctuating volatility of scores that you do get with traditional center wing players. And while Supercoach nowadays is more favorable to the guys who get the attacking stats, at least beginning of the season when scoring is generally down, I think there's nothing wrong with getting a good quality second row forward option who you can slot in your center wing. So just having a bit of a look at a deep dive at Dylan Lucas, So over 70-minute edge games in 23-24, 67.4 average. So that's about 4 points up on, well, actually about 4 to 5 points up on what he's priced at, with an average of 52 in base and 10 in evasive. So he's a very solid player, good work rate. If you look at the 80-minute games on the edge from last year, he had an average base of 51, 16 in evasive numbers. And so I think if you can get those kind of numbers in your center wing, I think you'd be pretty happy with that, because then you're not really having to pull your hair out wondering like, oh God, I've spent so much money on the center wing who I thought was playing for a gun team and I thought was going to get a bunch of tries. It hasn't worked out. With Dylan Lucas, if he's playing 80 minutes on the edge, then you're not going to have as much of that concern. And he also does have a pretty good draw on paper. Plays the Tigers twice in the opening 6 weeks, also has the Dolphins and the Titans as well. The round 4 bye isn't ideal, but I really like him as a pick. The big question with him is always which position does he play, because he is very versatile and he does often get slotted in at center at times. Now, at the moment, it looks like he should be an 80-minute edge. Well, it looks like he should be on the edge. Barry Tui, probably the best source available for Newcastle Knights news in the preseason. Someone asked him, surely Lucas gets 80 minutes on the edge, Baz. He was one of our best last year. And he, I think, responded, agree and yes. So that's all the confirmation bias that I need, because the numbers really do look very good for him when he plays those bigger minute games on the edge. And at the moment he's in my draft. He wasn't there at the beginning, but just pulling the numbers together, and I thought, well, 616k, I wanted to spend up in my center wing, but instead of going for someone maybe like a Garrick, who look, you know what, I won't compare him to Garrick, but just someone who's very solid and available, and with a good draw as well on paper. I think, look, it's preseason minutes watch as well, but if we get that 80-minute edge roll, I'm very interested. And I also think there's just so much value in having a dual player, especially a dual second row forward center wing. If any of you played last year, remember Ben Trbojevic, even if you didn't play him in your 17, he would have been so useful for you for doing trades and being able to swap him between those two positions. I think Dylan Lucas being that dual, and there's not many of those good ones, there's him and maybe like a Jack Bird. If you had both of them in your team and maybe you can alternate them, then that really does help in terms of squad flexibility, especially very much so at the beginning of the year. So yeah, very, very interested in Dylan Lucas, and I think these numbers do look very encouraging for him if he gets that 80-minute edge roll. Cam Murray at 610k. So many people are interested in him. The last few seasons have been a little bit down for Murray. He's always had some injuries that's kind of impacted him. He is a good base stat player. If you look at the base stat numbers of 53, it's only behind Carrigan on the list here. So he's normally very steady, very safe pick. His averages under Wayne Bennett is probably the big thing. It was 70, 68, and 69. So given that he's priced at 62, you're already looking at maybe 7 points of potential value there. Just quickly hop over to his dedicated slide. There you go. This is probably the player I had the most analysis. I spent the most time analyzing in terms of numbers, because there were so many people who were just like, especially after the round 1 announcement that he'd be back, people were just like, give us a Cam Murray deep dive. Where's the Murray deep dive? I was like, all right, let's put it together. So, but look, in saying all of that, he's not in my current round 1 team. I don't think he will make it at the moment either, but just hear me out. So if you look at the last 4 seasons in terms of his scoring breakdowns by times in the year, apart from 2022, he has always generally been, I found, a slow starter, Supercoach wise. So 2024, the first 10 rounds of the season, his average was 58, and that was down on his entire season average. In 23, it was 60, down on his entire season average. 22 was different, it was 77, which was up 6 points. But 2021, it was 62, down 8 points. So 3 of the last 4 seasons, his early starts or his rounds 1 to 10 averages have been below his entire season. The one thing that's consistent is his end of season performance is always better than his end of season. 77, 73, 71, and 71 are his averages in rounds 20 to 26 in the last 4 seasons. I didn't go all the way back to 2021, 2020, etc., but it could be similar. But at least in the last 4 years, we've seen that trend. So I think with Murray, just because he's making this early return from an injury, I'm also like, they probably wouldn't have him play round 1 unless he was fully right to go. So you have to assume that if the player's playing, then he's fine. But there is still a little bit of me that thinks, well, he was coming back early from an injury. And it was a wrist injury. So not like a leg one or anything, not muscular at least. So maybe it's not going to be such an impact to him. But at the moment, I'm thinking because he's an early return from an injury, maybe I just play it safe and wait it out and see how he looks, especially knowing that his early season form or performances, Supercoach-wise, generally are down as well. But he'll be very tempting, that's for sure. Like I say, he's not in my team right now. I think he'll be very interesting because if you look at the numbers on the screen here, so I'd expect him to be playing at lock. And when he was under Wayne Bennett playing at lock, 70, 68, and 69 averages. So he was someone who was pushing that high 60s average. And when he played over 60 minutes, again, this is the thing as well. I want to see him playing bigger minutes over 60 because in those earlier seasons, if you look back, it was 66 last year, 66 the year before, but then it was 78, 75, 70, 74. Like he has got that potential to be a gun second rower in Supercoach if he plays over 60 minutes, which he generally does do, but you want to be seeing that in the middle at lock. One thing that works in his favor is probably the draw. So look, there's no buys all the way until round 12. So at least you know that, and all the way up until State of Origin, he's going to be there barring any injuries, of course. And if you look at rounds 3 to round 8, it's a pretty tough run as well. Sharks, Penrith, Roosters, Cowboys, Bulldogs, and Melbourne. Very, very tough games in there, but I think that favors someone like Murray, who is going to be playing, hopefully, bigger minutes in the middle, a lot of base stats, probably tight games you'd expect earlier in the season as well. I can definitely see Murray just having to be relied on to play big minutes and have to tackle his butt off basically. So I can see Murray being a very, very solid starter, and I think look, he's probably my number 2 behind Olukwatu on that list there. But I think for me, it's just that coming back early from an injury, I know it's more of a gut feel rather than anything else. Gut feel plus probably look into the numbers about his early season starts. I think he will definitely be a consideration at some point during this year, and the starting price is very good. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe you're just thinking he's a former gun, he's 610k, I'm just going to get him. And that could be the right way of going about it. But maybe I'm someone who would rather start with someone else. And then if I get it wrong, then maybe I just trade down to him and right the wrong in that sense. The final player I wanted to cover on this particular list here is Jacob Preston. So a lot of people I've seen interested in him. I did a bit of a write-up on him as well on Patreon, I think on Instagram as well. So there's potentially 4 to 8 points of value, I think, with Preston. He is a try-scoring back rower. So if you look at his scoring stats breakdown here, it is the highest of all of these options on the list here. He scored 6 tries in both 23 and also in 2024, but that also came in much fewer games in 2024. Just having a quick look at a deep dive here. So I think with him, role is pretty safe. He generally is an 80-minute edge back rower. He's generally fared much better when he plays on the right-hand side, and you've got Viliame Kikau on the left anyway for the Bulldogs. So looking at his previous seasons, when he's averaged over 60 minutes, there wasn't that much of a step up in 23. It was only an extra 2 points, and last year was only an extra 4 points. So not a huge amount of gain in terms of averages. If you look at his 80-minute games though, 65.6 in 23, that's an extra 5 points of value, and it was 75 last year, so that's an extra 13 points. So I don't expect him to be someone to average 75 when he plays his 80-minute games, because I think last year was really boosted up by the tries that he was scoring. He had a few games where he actually went and scored a double. One good thing with him is I think the Bulldogs draw all the way up until round 12 is pretty good. They don't play Penrith or Melbourne, so they don't play any of the grand finalists. The toughest games that they've probably got are Sharks, Roosters, and then maybe you can argue the Rabbitohs and the Broncos round 7 and 8, just depending on how they're going. Otherwise, I think the overall draw is pretty good. So I know I just said Murray would be number 2, but thinking about it just now, I'm actually thinking because of that early return from injury risk, I might actually put Preston a little bit above Cam Murray. They're very similar priced as well. I think with Preston, you probably have that chance to be able to get more attacking stats in this opening part of the season. And then maybe, actually, you know what? I'm going to flip-flop back. I'm going to say Murray probably just over Preston, because I was thinking back to Murray not having any buy until round 12 and the tough games. I think Murray probably, in my opinion, will edge Preston just a little bit, but Preston would be number 3. So in terms of the second row forward picks on that list I had, it would be Olukwatu, then it would be Murray, then it would be Preston. Dylan Lucas would definitely feature, but I think he's going to be someone I'd rather have in your center wing. So I think with Preston, he's a great option. He's a bit more of a pod as well. If I just quickly go back here, he was only 5% ownership, so pretty low. And what I like about this price category that we're looking at, apart from Olukwatu, these guys are pods, but I think they're pretty fair picks. So I think if you're looking to pod up in your team somewhere, second row forward I find is not a bad spot, especially in the slightly higher end. Because again, with second row forwards, they're not going to be people who go and score like 20s and 30s, because they've got underlying good work rates, the most you expect out of them is like 50 to 60. Some people, if you went for a pod in your center wing, but it really doesn't come off and they're not a very good base stat center wing, you're looking at maybe someone who goes and scores 30 points and the alternative has scored 100, and you're just like, oh, I've gone pod for the sake of it. And when I say pod, I mean point of difference. Gone for someone point of difference and they've just not worked out, but then the loss that you've made against the similar position is much more compared to second row. If you decide I'm going to go for a different pod in second row, guess what? The best guy might go get 80, 90, but your other guy might go get 50. The difference isn't as much and it's not as punishing as well that way. So I do like this price range category in second row. Olukwatu would be my number one. I think just the draw looks really good. He is historically probably a SuperCoach gun, more so than maybe some of these other guys. Murray 2, and then I think Preston just about third, but Dylan Lucas very much like him, probably though in centre wing. So the final price category that I wanted to take a look at here is the 500k second row forwards. So I've selected a few that I think were more, not necessarily popular, but more maybe talking points. Number one is Isaiah Papali'i, 585k, 24% ownership, so very, very highly owned at the moment. I'm actually recording this on Sunday morning, just after Penrith played their very first preseason trial. Now look, I mean, it wasn't like he scored 26 SuperCoach points from that particular game. He was playing on the left-hand edge, but I don't know how much you read into that because there were so many big gun players from Penrith who weren't playing. I think, and the reason that IPAP played there, I think if you're concerned that, he was playing with the reserves, I think one thing that you have to remember is that the Penrith players all played all the way up until the grand final, whereas Isaiah Papali'i probably had an extra 4 to 5 weeks of rest. He probably he's probably in a position to be able to start playing earlier than some of those other guys in the main Penrith squad. So I wouldn't necessarily worry so much about the fact that he was playing with the reserves. For me, with IPAP, it all comes down to the role. I've written in the notes here, if he's on the right edge outside of Cleary, sign me up. He will be in my team because I think that's going to be an absolute gold mine for him. And I know some people are thinking, well, is this just what he is now? Like the last 2 seasons, he's kind of been around the 50 averaging player. If you look at the breakdown of stats here, everyone's thinking of 2022 and 2021 though, where he was an absolute gun averaging 79. And he was really a try scoring player back then as well. So he had 10 tries in 2022, all coming on the right hand side outside of Moses. So I think for me, this has been the number that's been locked into my head, is if IPAP's on the right edge outside of dominant half, if it's Moses in Parramatta, or if it's Cleary in Penrith, I just think I think he's a good player. And I think he's just got the potential. And I just think West Tigers probably just didn't quite work out. And so I think that's just what I think SuperCoach wise. Like, I know the numbers look not that great for last year, like around the early 50s. But you're just thinking more potential of the player. And if his role is outside Cleary, then awesome. If he wasn't and was playing on the left, my interest in him is less so. And I would maybe be willing to not start with him then. And instead, I'd probably opt to say, well, guess what? I'm just going to go with an Olukwatu or someone in that 600k range. And if IPAP kills it, I can just trade down to him at a worst. But he did play 5 80-minute edge games in 2024. So pretty small sample. And his average was 69.8 with an 52.8 in base. So like there was some glimpses last year that when he gets that role, he can put on some big scores. And I know one of those games in particular, I think he scored about 134. I think he may have scored a double. You just think that with playing with Penrith, that he's going to get more attacking stats. That's generally, I think, it. So while his base and base power might not change, the line breaks and the attacking stats we think is what's going to increase. Because if you look back at the last 2 years, he only scored 6 tries in total. Whereas in 2022 and 2021, he scored 17 in those 2 seasons. So you're just thinking, hopefully the attacking stats come back and then he'll go back to that. Maybe not quite the 79 average, but look, he's priced at what, 50, 58? He's priced at 60. He's probably someone who I think you can expect to get to 65, not 70, maybe 65 to 68. There is some potential value there. So he's currently in my team, but it is subject to change and also subject to whatever role we see him playing in preseason, or hopefully some kind of insider notes that we get before the start of the season. One of the things that I did read from, I think it was from Daily Telegraph or from Code, was that there is potentially some scope for him to play a bit of middle and also edge. So, and I think that's to partly fill the void of Fisher Harris leaving. So I think I don't quite know what that's going to look like in terms of output wise. I haven't pulled those numbers together. I would think it's not going to be as good as if it was just being parked 80 minutes outside Cleary or outside the other half for Penrith, just because I think we're looking at attacking stats being what we want to see here. And if he's playing middle with a little bit of edge, then I think the ability for attack stats does go down. I think if he was playing that hybrid role, then I'd probably say wait and watch for me. I probably won't start. It's, again, right edge role, 80 minutes, sign me up. Now, I'm not that interested in a lot of these other guys on the list here, but I thought I'll quickly mention them as it was. So Ruben Cotter is someone who I think he's really gone down in stocks for me anyway for this year. He's 3% ownership, which isn't that high. In seasons gone past, he has been much more popular. He's lost his front row forward dual status. I think that's the big reason. He's been available at front row in the past, which has been a pretty weak position. Now that he's only second row, it really, I think, does kill him as a bit of an option. And if you look at his last 3 years, averages wise, 59, 53, and then 57 last year, I think this is who he is. I just think, like, he's a gun footy player. When it comes to SuperCoach, I think he's just going to be someone who's kind of around those higher 50s. And so for me at 560, I just don't really see much value. He's lost that very useful duel, so probably not for me. Victor Radley is someone who very, very low ownership at 1%, but I wanted to put him in here just because I thought that with the loss of Terrell May and Weir Hargraves, maybe there's some extra minutes on offer for Radley if he plays in the middle. But when I pull the numbers together, in his games over 70 minutes last year, his average was 60. So look, it was an extra 5 points up. So there's 5 points of value. But again, we're looking, and if you still have to look at the absolute number of 60, and it's kind of like, it's not that inspiring. So while the numbers I thought would be good, because I know he had some games where he went over 100 a few times when playing 80 minutes in the middle, in those over 70-minute games, because I don't think he's going to be someone who always plays 80 minutes. So that's why I wanted to look at just over 70. And it was an average of 60, because he's had plenty of games where he plays 70-something minutes, but still only scores around kind of the early 50s. I think that probably not for me, especially when we just don't quite know what the minutes will look like with the new Roosters forward pack rotation. Viliami Kikau, I mean, look, he's never been an option for me personally. I know in seasons past when he's gone an average of 65 plus, there's always a bit of chat about like, oh, is this the season for Kikau? I mean, just look below me and look at the dark blue in base. If you look at everyone else, 45, 51, 45, 45, 31 for Kikau. He's just not someone who's got the work rate. He is reliant on attacking stats. Yes, the Bulldogs do have a good draw, but I think if you're looking at a Bulldogs edge, just take Jacob Preston. He's not that much more expensive. He's like 70k more, so 80k more, which isn't small. But I think Preston just has a much better work rate. Like Preston's base was around 45. Preston, without getting any attacking stats, can still get you 60. Kikau without any is probably going to get you more like 40, 45. Not interesting enough for me, I think. So he's got a little bit of ownership at 5%. Good draw, but just too low of a floor for me. He didn't score any tons either in 2024. John Bateman is someone who's piqued a little bit of interest in the community. 523k with an average of 53. In his 9 80-minute games last year for the Tigers, it was a 61.8 average. So we're looking at, call it 62. You're looking at 9 points of value. That's pretty good. But again, my main reservation is because it's still the absolute number of 62. Yes, while you're getting some value, if you're thinking of getting points value, ideally you would be making a lot more cash, I guess. When you're looking at paying 520k, kind of this more mid-range price, you get 9 points of value. Let's say it goes an average of 62. His price might go up maybe 100k and maybe 120k. And then at that point, you can maybe convert into another gun. But I think what you're looking at there is only 100k, but it's not like mass cash generation where when we look at value in like your cash cows and things, they're the ones who go up like 150, 200, 300k. I feel like just 100k probably quite isn't enough for me. And even then, it's 100k, but it's a 62 average. Yes, look, it's something for sure. Like, I think there's definitely going to be some value there if he gets those 80-minute games. Just don't probably quite know that at the moment. A lot of those came playing at middle and also on the edge. So it's uncertain where he's going to be for the Cowboys. He's probably going to be playing on the edge, given that Hylam Lukey unfortunately had that ACL injury, so he's going to be out. I think Bateman, I did prefer Bateman when he was playing in the middle. His upside was capped a little bit, but his base was better. If he's playing on the edge, probably won't quite be for me. And I just wanted to quickly call out Hosking here because I saw him in a little bit of teams as well. 53 average from last year. look, historically he's someone who's been pretty consistent, previous averages of 55 and 50. He does feel like someone who's going to be this early 50s averaging player. I think people are looking at him though because he started last year on fire. He had like a 97 and I think 105, but he scored a try in each of those games and he was actually looking like he was going to make a bunch of cash. Then unfortunately he got injured. So I think the norm is probably going to be what you're seeing here, 55, 50, 53. That's probably the kind of average I would expect out of Hosking. And I don't expect him to be someone who scores a bucket load of tries as well. So I think his total average from last year is probably a little bit inflated. So for me on this list here, IPAP, it piques the most interest. Second would probably be Bateman. But I think you saw how long I spent on those 600k guys. I'm much more interested in, I think, starting with one of them if I can. And then if I have to, you can trade down to someone in this price range, but it's much harder to do the opposite. Alright guys, that is my video done on the second row forward guns. Hopefully you enjoyed that one and got you thinking about your squad structure and which of these guys you wanted to pick. If you enjoyed it, please do give it a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing below as well to see more content in the preseason. Unfortunately, things have been a little bit slower. This just getting very busy just in the lead up to the wedding, which is obviously very important. It just means the time to do things like content is a little bit harder, but hopefully you enjoyed this one that I've put out anyway, and we'll see you all in the next one.